Hey guys, you should be able to hear me and see me. There we go. Okay, there we go. Hey guys, you should be able to hear me. All right, so this quiz is going to be about 30 questions, multiple choice, and it's going to be on the Industrial Revolution. So we had three separate different parts of the notes, so let's kind of run through them real quickly here, and I'll leave you guys to the rest of your night. At some point, I'm going to be also giving that extra credit question. So if you are here, good for you, and you should get an extra point. So let me move this over. So this is from the first set of notes that Mrs. Kipperman did with most of you guys. It's about the Industrial Revolution and kind of its beginnings, right? So if you have any questions, don't be shy and throw them into the chat, and then we'll keep going. So the Industrial Revolution, it referred to the transformation from mostly handmade goods to machine-made goods, right? We're going to be going from that kind of cottage-based industry in the home, where people created things, to factories and industrial-based factories, typically in cities, right? We know that the Industrial Revolution is going to begin mostly in England as a result of the resources that they have. So the resources that they have, things like iron ore, coal. We have good streams and things also that they're going to be able to use as power sources, right? You're going to start with mills, and mills being able to basically be able to be used as a power source to turn the mill to grind flour or do other sorts of things, right? That's where the first power is going to be coming from for these factories. You're going to have coal also, and these natural resources mixed with the political stability of the time period in England is going to what kind of makes it ripe for the beginnings of these industrial revolutions, right? We also know that eventually we're going to get the invention of the steam engine, right, by James Watt, and the steam engine that's going to really set the tone now and really spark the production of these different factories as well, right? So put it all together, you have the production from land, a group of people, which is the workers, the labor, and ultimately resources and wealth that's going to kind of come together to be able to now push the Industrial Revolution and create the factories and drive now this wealth, right? So it's going to begin at first with what is known as the cotton industry, the textile industry. It's going to be the first that's going to be industrialized, followed pretty closely by the iron industry, and then the steel industry is going to come after that, after we get the development of the Bessemer process. So we also have industrialization being moved in England by what's known as the enclosure movement, where people had traditionally farmed and grazed their livestock on common land all around. What's going to now happen is that you have wealthy people and these giant landowners are going to enclose their land for more efficient grazing and farming. But what that's going to do is it's going to shut off everybody else from this, right? So as a result, your average person and your common person is no longer going to be able to kind of farm and graze on this land anymore, and they're going to be looking for opportunity elsewhere, right? So from England, the Industrial Revolution is going to spread out to the rest of Europe and the United States. So we are also going to have this kind of second agricultural revolution during this time period, which is going to start to produce more food as well as a result of the technologies and advancements in agriculture. That's going to really now be able to cause population growth, but with the mechanization of farming in some cases, right, it's going to actually two factors here, right? The more population, they're just not going to be able to stay, and they're going to be looking for opportunities elsewhere. But also, the mechanization is going to force people off of these farms and need to go toward where other opportunities are going to be, right? Which is now going to create the labor force for the factories in the cities. So you're going to start to have a push out from these areas, the agricultural areas, to the cities during this time period. So we are going to get improved roads, improved canals, railroads are going to become a thing now, and that the railroads are going to help fuel the industrialization just as much as any of these other things, right? Roads are going to help allow goods move from urban areas to rural areas and vice versa. The canals will help on the waterways to be able to get goods out to oceans to ship elsewhere if necessary, or just around the waterways in England. And the railroads are going to also make it much more efficient to be able to move large quantities of goods and much more cheaply, right? So we know that there's going to be urbanization during this time period where these rural populations who were looking for these new opportunities are going to be leaving the rural areas, going to the factories in the cities, right? Which is going to be, this is what urbanization is. So you also have an increased standard of living for a good amount of people, right? You're going to start to get the kind of development of a little bit of a middle class here, but this increased standard of living is not necessarily for everyone. And we do know that some of the conditions in the late 1800s during this time period are going to be pretty rough for some people. Right? So you're going to get population increases. You're going to get increases in education. You're going to get dissatisfaction with the working conditions that we were just talking about. But you're also going to now have pollution from these factories and unfettered factories being able to kind of just release this pollution with relatively little regulation to limit that and what they do with the byproducts of and waste of their industry. So the inventions that you should be familiar with, right? We talked about James Watt just a second ago with the improvement of the steam engine, which is going to help drive a large amount of the factories in the first place. You're going to have Henry Bessemer, who's going to develop this process, for a much more efficient process for processing and making steel. And after the Bessemer process is going to kind of take hold, you're going to be able to get cities, the modern city that we know, right? You're going to get skyscrapers being able to be built because steel is significantly stronger than iron and also much lighter, so it's going to be able to be utilized in a much different capacity to build these enormous structures, bridges and tall buildings and things. It's going to really take off in America with Carnegie Steel, who's going to basically take Henry Bessemer's process and bring it over there. You have Eli Whitney, who invents the cotton gin, which is going to be able to now increase the amount of cotton that's going to be brought to market to be able to now be processed into other goods, into the textiles, right? So you have James Hargreaves, who's going to take advantage of that and create the spinning jenny, which is essentially a way to bring all of this textiles together much more quickly and weave them together, right? So the Industrial Revolution is going to create the factory system. Factories, we know, are larger buildings that hold the machines that are going to be used for manufacturing things and making goods. And the factory system is going to begin to really kill off the cottage industry, right? They're individual workers working from the homes. It's just not going to be nearly as efficient. Then they're not even going to be able to come close to competing with the factories in some cases quality, but also just the sheer amount of factories are going to be able to produce with the labor that they're going to have. And we know the Industrial Revolution, as we just said a second ago too, is that it's going to quickly spread to Western Europe and the United States. So that is a bit of a recap of the first one. So if you have any questions about that, don't be shy, and I will start the second one here. So, work and labor, right? So the second part, we know that we were saying that the pre-industrial economy was agricultural, right? Economies were based on the family unit in particular, in those cottage industries we were just describing, right? We know now that it's going to displace those family-based cottage industries with the factory system, and it's going to have a significant impact now on the structure and the function of a family. It's going to be quite a bit, it's going to be beginning to be quite a bit different than what they had been familiar with. So, the nature of the work in the factory is pretty tough in the late 1800s, right? You have pretty harsh working conditions. You're going to have long working hours, sometimes 14, 16, 18 hours a day. You're going to work before the sun comes up and going home when after the sun goes down. You're not home for very long. You have very long work weeks. Typically 6, at least mostly 7-day work weeks. There's the conditions in these factories are often unsafe and even unhealthy, as they'd been unregulated more or less up till this point, and there's lots of competition with the urbanization that's going on. So as a result, if I can hire people to do this unskilled labor, and just a race to the bottom as far as what I'm going to pay them if people need the money and need the opportunity, right? So when you get women and children entering the workplace, also to help make ends meet from this family unit, it's just going to make labor even cheaper, and people are going to be working for all in all of these harsh conditions for pretty little pay when it really comes down to it. So we know that men are going to compete with women and children for these wages. You do have the child labor that's going to help keep the cost of production low, because they're going to be able to help. They're going to be able to pay these kids a bit less, right? So by paying the workers as little as possible, it's going to help the person who owns the means of production to keep their profits as high as possible, right? So you have owners and mines and the factories exercising quite a bit of control over their laborers, because these laborers often didn't have any other options, right? So they were kind of at the mercy of these people who owned these things. In some cases, they lived in factory-owned homes. You had these streets where people were just crammed in. The laborers were just crammed in. The open sewers made the conditions in these areas relatively unsafe and unsanitary. So all in all, again, the late 1800s were a pretty rough place to live, for sure. We had company towns and company-owned stores where they might only get paid in currency that's going to be able to buy things in the company-owned store, or that'll make up a large part of what they get paid anyway. And in some cases, you even had the mine and factory owners kind of requiring some mandatory activities on days off. So even if you did get a day off, you weren't necessarily off to just relax and do whatever you wanted. You were forced still to do, you were at the whims of these factory and mine owners, right? Pretty rough spot. So what happened now is people were only going to put up with these terrible conditions for so long, and you're going to get the rise of what are known as labor unions, the organization of labor into these unions in particular, right? So that's what they're trying to do. The workers are Wilson. It didn't pay that much. It's going to differ depending on which country you are in, but we're talking cents, per hour kind of thing. It's pretty low, for sure, right? So the organization of labor, the whole idea is that these workers are going to be trying to gain some sort of leverage over their employer, right? So if enough workers are going to strike and not work, and there aren't workers to kind of fill in this particular industry or particular spot, what happens is the employer might have to consider their demands in order to keep production going and not lose because the people are striking, right? In the other hand, if there are people that are willing to still keep working and those people are not, then they're going to just hire these people who are willing to at the low wages, and then that's it. Other people that are striking are just going to be fired, and they're going to be out of a job, and they're not going to be able to feed their families. So there's kind of a tough balance here for these unions and strikers, and they often needed quite a bit of involvement in order for this to work. So often these strikes, though, and the collective bargaining of these unions and the hard-fought kind of deal for these people is going to lead to increased wages and improved working conditions. You're even going to have laws now that are going to help improve the lives of the workers, including women and children. You're going to get child labor laws, and you're going to get laws now protecting the worker, trying to make conditions in the workplace a bit more safe and sanitary and such. So that's kind of what we were just this slide is kind of what we were just saying. You have this whole idea of collective bargaining between labor and the management. It's this big back and forth between these different groups. Each group is trying to gain leverage over the other as best as they can. Union workers typically with strikes and other options, depending on how many people they have. and then labor is trying to pay as little, not labor, sorry, management is trying to pay as little as possible to pad their pockets and their bottom dollar as much as they can, right? But we do know in a long enough timeline, labor is going to be fairly successful, and that's part of the reason why we have things like 5-day work weeks and 40-hour work weeks, the end of child labor, the expansion of education, with women being involved in this as well and working. You're going to now have women demanding the right to vote, demanding women's suffrage, and ultimately being successful as well. Right? We also know that in America, in particular, the Industrial Revolution is going to have a bit of an impact on slavery. The cotton gin is actually going to increase demand for slaves because as now the slaves are going to be much more efficient in producing this cotton, and now with machines and factories being able to spin this cotton in record weight, in record numbers, essentially, more efficiently, then they just want more and more of it, right? So there's now a demand for more and more slaves working in the American cotton plantations in the South, right? Eventually, Britain is going to kind of morally be against slavery and outlaw the slave trade and slavery, but America is going to be kind of behind on this, and they're going to fight an entire civil war over that, right? So, two last things we should familiarize ourselves with. You have Edward Jenner, who developed smallpox vaccination, and you have Louis Pasteur, who is going to discover bacteria. And the whole idea of germ theory is going to be a huge revelation, and it's going to really rapidly change what we know about modern medicine. And it's going to be when we begin to medicine is really going to take off, right? Knowing these things. Okay, so we're down to our last one here. So now would be a good time for me to tell you guys what the extra credit question is. So the extra credit question is 2 parts for 1 point. And the extra credit question is, what are mine and Mrs. Kipperman's middle names? So my name is Michael. Just nice and easy to spell, Michael. And Mrs. Kipperman's middle name is, I'm going to look at it right here, is Elena. So it's E-L-A-I-N-A. Once again, E-L-A-I-N-A is Elena, Mrs. Kipperman's middle name. So if you know those two, you'll get the extra credit point, plus any extra credit points you may have already gotten as a result of our factory activity the other day. So let's go into our last set of notes here, and I will leave you guys to your studying and any last questions that you might have. All right, so capitalism and socialism, right? Two big different things, right? So the capitalism is the belief that private individuals, not government, should ultimately be in charge of business, right? So a large part of capitalistic theory is going to come from a man named Adam Smith, who writes a book around this time period known as The Wealth of Nations, and he believes in free markets with limited government or no government control, and he talks of the word laissez-faire, which is a French word which essentially means let do, or really when it comes down to it, just kind of leave the markets alone, and the markets will essentially take care of themselves, right? So you have this law of supply and demand and self-interest in competition, and when it all comes down to it, a company that's doing well will either compete or be outcompeted, and if it's outcompeted, it will kind of disappear and not work, and if it's doing well, then it'll survive, right? So that's capitalism in a nutshell, anyway. So it fuels competition in the Industrial Revolution, right? And with this competition, in a lot of cases, it's going to create wealth. You're going to have a massive now shift of production during the Industrial Revolution, and people are going to really be able to start making tons and tons of money for themselves. And it's going to now create a new class of wealth that didn't necessarily exist, and increase the standard of living for some people that didn't necessarily, they weren't aristocrats, right? So you have a middle class and even wealthier class that's going to be coming from this, right? But On the other hand, this wealth is often going to be generated on the backs of other laborers, right? And therefore increase the dissatisfaction with poor working conditions that we were just talking about, and this now unequal distribution of wealth in society. So you have another thing at the time, sorry, 1 second here, is this idea of socialism also develop, right? And the idea is now that the state should own the means of production and not necessarily individuals. So it's quite a bit of a different theory, quite a bit of different idea here, and that ultimately society should operate on behalf of all of the people, right? That wealth should be distributed pretty fairly between these different people, and that society should essentially work together to generate this relatively even distribution of wealth for everybody, right? Is this idea of socialism. Sometimes it's mentioned as kind of this idea of a welfare state, but there's socialistic ideas like education, or free education, free advanced education for people, free healthcare, and things like that would be paid for essentially by the taxes of the people, right? So we do know that a few European countries are socialistic today, right? They're not necessarily all socialist. Most of them have adopted some sort of what's called democratic socialism, and they have these things, right? They have healthcare that's centralized by the government, and their taxes pay for it. Education is relatively cheap out of pocket as well for people as a result of the tax rates and things like that. You also have socialized childcare. Governments do own some of these industries, and as a result, they're able to do this. Then this has been achieved by peaceful parliamentary means, right? Which means they have come to these conclusions and decisions democratically, right? We have socialized instances here in America too, right? We have Social Security is a socialistic policy. I mean, the police force, the fire departments, the army on some level, right? All of these things are paid for by tax dollars, right? They're centralized, government run, though they are socialistic in nature in some capacity, right? So you have communism now as kind of a branch of this idea of socialism, right? And this is generated by a man named Karl Marx, who is going to write 2 books, one in particular, this Communist Manifesto with a man named Friedrich Engels, and also Das Kapital, and they have this slogan, it's kind of workers of the world unite, and it's meant to be this response to the injustices of capitalism, right? There's no real private ownership of property, that all property should be owned effectively by the community, right? It is again just it's a extension of socialism. In some cases, they're used interchangeably, and the idea is that ultimately a classless society where everyone was equal and equal status socially and economic status is the end goal. And the hope for Karl Marx and some of these early revolutionaries of communism is that communism would become a global and worldwide phenomenon, right? And that history had always been what he called class warfare between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie was the wealthy owners of the production, and the proletariat were the laborers and the workers, right? And that this class warfare would inevitably always lead to what he called a violent revolution, and that the proletariat outnumbering the bourgeoisie would win, and they would establish this workers' paradise and this communistic paradise and redistribute this wealth to everyone, right? Again, to form that classless society. That was the hope, right, for them. And this redistribution of wealth was extremely important to communists. You're going to have the Russian Revolution. You're going to have the Chinese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, right? Lenin, Mao Zedong, and Fidel Castro, all pushing these. You're going to have the communism as well in Vietnam and other countries as well, right? So you do have, as I said, violent revolutions around the world, and the thought initially again of Marx being that this classless society develops, that it never really existed in these communistic countries. You're going to end up with totalitarian regimes. I guess someone needs to run things in the first place. And often you're going to have mass slaughter and mass poverty and international conflict over this. There's going to be massive conflicts between democratic countries and communistic countries around the world, right? The Cold War being this big instance where the world is a very tense place for a number of years because of the conflict between the two. Okay, so that is it for the most part there. That's a quick rundown of what we talked about in class. So if you have any last questions, now would be the time. If not, I'm going to sign off here, and I will leave you guys to your studying and your night. All right, I think since there's no more questions, then I'll sign off. So night, guys. Good luck with the rest of your study.